Good morning. As many of you know, my name is Father Leo Gajardo. I'm a priest of the Diocese of Gary. For the past few years, I've been studying in Rome, and next month I will begin a new assignment working at the seminary in Washington, D.C., but I'm home for the summer, and for me it's a great joy and a great blessing to be able to celebrate the Holy Eucharist with you today. Last month, as I was wrapping up my studies abroad, I spent a month traveling. I spent 2 weeks in Paris, a week in London, and finally I finished my time of studies by coming back from England on the Queen Mary 2. It was a week-long voyage, and it was really a wonderful experience. But wherever I went, whether in France or in England or on the ship, whenever I started a conversation with someone and they found out that I was from the States, the first question they would ask me inevitably was, "So what do you make of the political situation in the US?" It seems like not only here but everywhere, people are obsessed with American politics. And I thought about that experience as I reflected on the gospel today, because we are not the first society that is truly obsessed with politics. And the gospel today hints at the fact that in Jesus' time, it was a very similar situation. After Jesus had fed the large crowd, multiplying the loaves, where there was this overabundance of bread, the crowd was amazed. They were stunned at what Jesus had done, this tremendous sign that he had performed in their midst. And John tells us, Jesus knew that they were going to come and carry him off to make him king. And therefore, he withdrew again from the mountain. Now, for us to understand this statement, we have to remember that in Jesus' time, people were as obsessed, if not more obsessed with politics than we are today. Remember the situation in which the Israelites found themselves. They had been told by God, they had been promised by God that they were going to be his chosen people, a nation set apart, in the midst of all the other nations, to shine as a brilliant example of God's love for humanity. And yet, time and again, that promise seemed to be destroyed as they were conquered by nations around them. And ultimately, in Jesus' time, the people had been conquered by the Romans, perhaps the worst of foreign invaders that they had encountered. And so people were always talking about, debating, arguing about politics. How it is that we are to act in the midst of this situation in which we find ourselves. Some thought that the right thing to do was to collaborate, to go along, to try to just keep your head down and not cause too much trouble. Others wanted to, as much as possible, separate themselves from politics, isolate themselves, and just do their own thing. Others wanted to take up arms and start rebellions against those oppressing powers. And so when the crowd saw Jesus perform this tremendous miracle, because they were always thinking about politics, it was always on their mind, they immediately wanted to cast Jesus in political terms. They wanted to give him a political title and office. That's how they tried to make sense of who Jesus was for them. They wanted to make him their king. But interestingly, Jesus rejects their categorization. He doesn't accept the title of king. And so he withdraws from the crowd. He separates himself from them. He puts a bit of distance between them. Now, that's what we hear in today's gospel. Over the next 4 Sundays, starting next Sunday, we will hear the next part of this narrative. Because after withdrawing from the crowd, Jesus will return to them, but will begin to teach them, will begin to speak to them about who he really is for them, what his relationship with them is really about. And the church will offer us an opportunity over 4 successive Sundays to listen to that teaching of Jesus to the crowd. It's called the Bread of Life Discourse. It's from the 6th chapter of the Gospel of John. And every 3 years, the church gives us these 4 weeks to reflect together upon how Jesus presented himself to the crowd. And it's appropriate for us that since we find ourselves in a situation similar to that of the crowd, where we are constantly thinking about politics, that we should listen to this speech like the crowd did. To listen to what Jesus has to say to us about who he is and who he is in relation to us. Now, don't get me wrong. Politics is important. Like the Israelites, we today face very important questions in our society. Questions that deserve consideration and debate and reflection. But what we can't forget is that as Christians, we can't enter these conversations, these discussions, these debates as mere partisans. We have to participate and contribute to this important conversation as disciples of the Lord Jesus. And so that's why it's going to be so important for us over the next 4 weeks to listen attentively to what Jesus has to say to us. As we listen to the Bread of Life discourse Sunday after Sunday, for the next month, you and I will be invited by the Lord to discover once again who he is and who he wants to be for us. And in listening to Jesus, in discovering once again his identity, we will discover once again our identity, who we are supposed to be for him and who we are supposed to be for our brothers and sisters. St. Paul, in today's second reading from his letter to the Ephesians, begins to point to this same dynamic. He reminds the Ephesians of the behavior that they are to have, their engagement with each other. But he says that behavior is supposed to flow, above all, from their relationship with God. It's not the other way around. We don't define God based on our preferences and choices. Rather, we get to know God. We allow him to teach us who he is and who we are called to be. And from that, it becomes possible for us to engage with one another. And so, brothers and sisters, I want to offer an invitation to you. Over the next 4 weeks, take the time to listen to the Lord. Open your minds and your hearts and your hands to what the Lord wants to reveal to us about who he is and who we are called to be because of that. In a special way, we will be privileged to listen to the Bread of Life discourse exactly at the time when we come together to celebrate the Eucharist. And this is the most appropriate setting for us to listen to the words of Jesus. Because in this celebration, every time we gather to celebrate the Holy Eucharist, the words that we hear Jesus speak to us become a reality for us. As he who is the bread of life, who gives life to the world, once again gives his life to us in the sacrament of his body and blood. So that in welcoming him, in receiving him, we can be empowered to share that same life with all our brothers and sisters.
Amen.